Hi, welcome to Cloud Camp. My name is Bob Duffy, and we're going to talk about hybrid BI with the Power BI data gateway. For those who don't know me, my name is Bob Duffy. I've been working as a database and BI architect for a long time in Ireland. I used to work at Microsoft a good while ago, and I now work at what we call the ProData SQL Center of Excellence, where we help customers implement enterprise technologies at the enterprise level, like sort of Power BI analysis services and stuff like that. So this talk really comes from our experience in helping customers work with what we call the data gateway. So this is what we're going to discuss over the next hour. The architecture and components that make up the gateway and the use cases for it, and then a little bit about like identity, security, how it's deployed, and troubleshooting. So when you're working with Power BI, one of the fantastic things that makes it so compelling is the number of data sources that you can work with, cloud-based data sources. So you can either work with a large number of databases, and this is only part of the list, right? I mean, I don't see, for example, Amazon Redshift is going to be in there and stuff like that, right? So most online cloud databases you can natively connect to in Power BI. And there's also a number of services, okay, so like applications and services that you connect to, not only the Microsoft ones, but also, PayPal. I mean, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of cloud-based providers have applications that you can install that work with Power BI. So how does that work? Well, you have your cloud-based data source, okay? So either databases or kind of services, and you're generally going to be using Power BI desktop. So, you're going to be using queries and mashups you can pull from multiple sources, join all the data, make data sets that you build your reports on sort of top of, right? Now, this is obviously working at the desktop level, and then when you publish it to the Power BI service, you can either have it in a workspace, which is just for a few people to sort of collaborate it, or you can publish it as an application for the whole organization to use, okay? And then your users are going to access it via a browser, via an application, via a mobile device, or there is even a new Excel functionality where you can hook directly into the data set, and identity is all provided via Azure Active Directory. So if your solution looks like this, you are living the dream, right? You're 100% cloud-based, serverless, happy days, right? But more often than not, our solutions look like this, okay? So there's lots of on-source, on-premises data. Might be certainly flat files could be in the cloud because they could be in SharePoint Online, but they might be an SMB share, right? Or they could be on a local computer. Analysis services models. So the models that you build with Power BI Desktop are quite limited in that, they go to max size of about a gigabyte. I mean, we work with kind of customers that have analysis services models that are hundreds of gigabytes, right? So we have to use the full version of analysis services. Now, there is a platform as a service version of that, but for some reasons, you might still have online sources, and you're certainly going to have line of business systems, SQL Server databases, CRMs, ERPs, and so forth. We've connected mainframes to Power BI's, DB2 mainframes and stuff. Some of them have either database drivers or flat file export. Anyway, you'll have these kind of sources of data. You might be merging them with other datas. Often you're just bringing them into a data warehouse, which might not yet be one of the platforms as a service. It could be running on this. Now, bear in mind, when I say on-premise, this could also be a VM running in Azure. As far as we're concerned, we sort of call that on-premise, right? Because it's still a traditional Windows server. So when you're in this environment, obviously the problem is that when you publish to the Power BI service and your users are consuming away, um, if they're only consuming the version of the workbook that's been sort of published up there, that's fine, right? You know, it's going to work fantastic. But what if they want to refresh? You know, the next day comes along and they want the next kind of set of data. Unless you're going to go to your Power BI sort of desktop, re-query all the things, and then sort of publish it, it's going to be stale, right? So we need a way for the Power BI service kind of running in the cloud with very little connection to the on-premise kind of data to be able to refresh that kind of data. And some of the technologies like analysis services support live connections, where as soon as you click on a slicer, it's running a query direct back on the analysis services model. So this is where the on-premise data gateway comes in. So what happens there is the cloud can request a query, and effectively the on-premises data gateway is going to query on its behalf, and we'll go a little bit deeper into the mechanics of that. But that's the missing piece of the puzzle that lets you have that hybrid solution that combines your cloud-based data with your on-premise data. Okay, so how do you get data into Power BI Desktop? Well, there's three ways of doing that. One, if you've imported your sort of data and you're running in cache mode, so you're actually using a Power BI model, which is limited to about a gigabyte or so, then generally what happens is you're going to refresh the entire data set kind of nightly or something like that, right? So that's we call an import or a refresh. A live and a direct query are both where they're streamed from the kind of model, but they're slightly different in architecture. Live is where only really for an analysis kind of services, and that's where you're replacing the Power BI kind of model with an analysis services model. So the enterprise model rather than the smaller functionality provided by Power BI. So every time a user clicks on a chart, it's a live query going back to the analysis services. Direct query, which is a little bit more complex, is where you have an analysis services model or a Power BI kind of model that provides the semantic layer, but the actual queries are then fired at the underlying, usually relational source. This is a technology that used to be called Rollup. Okay, they both end up at the same thing where the actual query has to hit the underlying on-premise data source. So just to show you what the get data and the publishing experience looks like when you're working with on-premise data. So here, there's one I prepared earlier, but let's go to Power BI Desktop, right? So I run Power BI Desktop, here. And I can hit my get data button. Now, when I go to the more, what you'll see is there's a massive range of like online kind of services. Now, I largely don't need the data gateway for these, right? There's also Azure platform as a service ones, but more often than not, what we're using is connecting to sort of databases. Now, some of the databases that you're connecting to, like Amazon Redshift, Google BigQuery, and so forth, are already in the cloud, so you probably don't need the on-premise data gateway for that. But other ones, such as if you're using analysis service on a VM or something like that, or if you're connecting to a line of business Oracle database or SQL database, you probably will. So I'm going to connect to an analysis services for a live connection. So look, the default when I use analysis services, don't know if you see that, is I can connect live or import. I pretty much always want to connect live. I connect to the model that I want to, and then I can start to run queries there, right? So I'm going to look at a time series of cells by the cells amount by date, for example, right? There you go. Oh, did I click cells amount? There we go. Yay. And I can add slicers and filters and something else. Now, it doesn't talk about making up Power BI reports. So I just want to show you the get data kind of functionality, and I'll go to here's one I prepared earlier, right? So here's an AdventureWorks report that I made up, which I'm currently looking at sales in France, and I see the main towns, the trend, what the occupations were, and so forth. I see that most of my sales are in Paris. Secondly, where the hell's this? Yeah, so that area there is my, which is just outside Paris actually, is the second biggest city, and so forth. And I can break that down by these little slices, right? It's grand. Now, we'll come to this kind of later. We usually always put the username of the report on there in an enterprise environment. And I do that just by adding a calculated measure. So I've got a calculated measure that has, now there's a username and a user principal name. I don't fully know what the difference between them is. Saved up to the cloud. What I'm then going to do is go to Power BI, log in. It's all right. Yeah. Log me in, and I can go to my workspace that the report was kind of published in, and I can try it and run the report. Now, I might get a problem running the report because can't load the model schema because effectively can't access the data source. So you get the author of the report and it say, hey, either I can't connect to the gateway or I can't access the data source or vice versa. So what I have to do is to install and configure the gateway. Now let's talk about single sign-on, right? So you want the identity of the user clicking a report in Power BI to be known to the model that's running the query, be that more often than not that it is analysis services, right? So where you're looking at live queries to a model, obviously that's going to have to be analysis services. The way that that works is there's two active directories because obviously on-premise is going to be your full fat active directory, and in Power BI it's going to be your Azure active directory. So what happens is it will take the username, or more specifically the UPN, so bob at prodata.in is the UPN suffix, is prodata.ie. It'll pass that encrypted with the message to run the query. It run the query under the context of the credentials for the data source. It'll then activate impersonation so the effective username is the user who clicked the report. Now, one of the most common errors that you will get is, first of all, it won't work, right? And secondly, when you run Profiler on the analysis services, you'll see something like this, an error message saying the following system occurred, the username or password is incorrect, right? So that either means the user didn't have, so what this generally means is that it's invalid credentials from the cloud are not known on premise, and therefore the gateway won't work for them, okay? So the first thing you've got to do is make sure the user is both on the on-premise Active Directory and in the Azure Active Directory, okay? Secondly, we have to make sure that the UPN suffix, so that at prodata.ie, that they use in Power BI is the same as the on-premise UPN suffix. So if you're not sure what your UPN suffix is on-premise, there's a command that you can type in whoami / kind of UPN, and that will give you what that is. You know what your UPN suffix is in. If you're not sure what it is, there's a function called username in kind of DAX, and you can create a measure and actually put that on the report. and it'll tell you what the current kind of username is, right? What should happen is there's a tool called dsync that's run that syncs the on-premise Active Directory, okay? So the same should, but if it doesn't, one of the most common issues is a UPN suffix. For example, locally, it could be at prodata.local. It might not be at pro.ie because that's our internet. That's our internet-based one. Or some companies have a completely different local UPN kind of suffix, right? So if it doesn't work, there's two ways of fixing that, right? One is there's a new, because so many customers hit this problem, they added a feature into Power BI to map usernames. So what you can do is you can go into the settings and you can map from what the Power BI knows the user as to what they're known as on premise. Okay, so just to show you that in operation, if I go to here, if I go to my gateway, go to my analysis services source, go to my users, see this map usernames things, and I can add the map there. And when I then have a test user, I can test that rule and it'll fire a query, it try and get a connection to the on-premise data source to see if that works now, right? So that's good both for testing. If I go somewhere it doesn't exist. Okay, so didn't work out what it is. Okay, so the other way of fixing it is what some customers have done is actually change their on-premise Active Directory. So if you go into the domains and services in Active Directory, you can add additional UPN suffixes. And then what you can do is for each user, you can assign them what their default UPN suffix is. So for example, that's my Active Directory account on-premise, right? So I can switch between at prodata.local, I can switch it to at prodata.ie. So we do have some customers who've gone through an Active Directory exercise to make sure that their cloud identity has the same UPN suffix as the on-premise identity. Happy days, it all works kind of seamlessly. If it doesn't, then the kind of mapping is a good way to get around that. Now, we've only talked about analysis services. The other situation where you might want identity flow is if you're using direct query. Is anyone here using direct query? Yeah, so it's not something that we use a lot because there's a lot of performance and compatibility issues with getting it to work, right? But if you do need a live connection to a relational source, direct query is kind of the only show in town for Power BI, right? So what happens here is when you define the data source, there's an advanced settings, and you can effectively get the identity flow. Now this works slightly different. It uses Kerberos. So what will happen is the credentials will be passed to the data source via Kerberos. So there's additional configuration to be done. Anyone who's used to configuring the good old-fashioned on-premise reporting services, Excel, and analysis services will be well used to configuring Kerberos, right? And you'd have to do that for the relevant sources like SQL or SAP HANA or something like that, right? Now, this isn't something that we've had to do because we don't tend to use direct query. We tend to use either live query to an analysis service model or just the cache mode. Now, once we've got the identity flowing, the main reason why you want the identity to flow is that's authentication, authorization, right? You want to limit the data so that if someone in department A accesses a Power BI report or country A, they only see the information for that. If someone in country B does that, they only see it for someone else. So the first thing that you need to do, even before you talk about row level security, is to effectively get the username function working so the correct user is displayed, right? Once you've done that, the procedure is quite straightforward. What you'll do is you'll add roles to the model to say what the restrictions are, and then you can put filters on those roles. Okay. So I will show a demo of that. Now let's talk about deployment options, right? So there's a few ways to deploy the gateway. If you go to Microsoft's guidance, I'm not sure I quite follow it. They're like, yep, deploy it on a separate VM, right? Well, that's all great, but in a lot of environments, I have to admit, we do not deploy the on-premise data gateway to a completely separate VM, completely by itself. Yeah, that's a best practice, but it depends on a few factors. One is the scale of your solution. You've got to look at what sort of concurrency you have. Do you need for any high availability? If you need it to be highly available, it's going to probably have to be on its own box, right? And what sort of isolation do you need from the other workloads? So the starting pattern for really small solutions, and what I mean by small is probably, under 100 users, right? Which, for a lot of people is under 100 users with less than 10 concurrent, right? With less than 5 or 10 concurrent. For those types of users, this type of solution isn't bad, where you just deploy everything on a single VM, and in that case, you might have your on-premise data warehouse, your on-premise ETL integration, your on-premise reporting services, your on-premise analysis services, and the gateway to connect to Power BI all on a single 4 or 8 core kind of VM. Okay, we never go above an 8 core VM for analysis services. Well, we virtually never go above an 8 core VM for analysis services. Anyone know why? Yeah. NUMA compatibility, because it's an in-memory engine, it gets killed by cross NUMA calls. So you should, if you're installing analysis services on a multi NUMA box, it might not work out as well as you'd hope, right? Now, as you get to a larger number of users, you're probably going to want to split those roles, right? So the next pattern and this is one that we do with some of our larger customers, going up to a couple of hundred users, right? So you might have 25 concurrent or something like that. In here, you'll have a separate data warehouse server and a separate BI server. And on the BI server is where the gateway was, because the gateway is going to be connecting to the analysis server. This works quite well for, after you get to a couple of 100 or 200 users, 10, 15 or 20 concurrent. And what we like about this is the isolation between here, so that if the BI server is down, the kind of data warehouse server can kind of still do its load, but also the data warehouse server is doing massive loads and is completely killing the kind of VM. The BI service to the end users isn't affected, so you get a nice workload isolation from that point of view. As you start to get into the kind of hundreds of users, and into the thousands of users, you might want to look at a dedicated gateway. But also, if you're also using a general purpose data gateway where it's nothing to do with Power BI, but it's also to do with connecting to Power Apps to lots of data sources throughout the enterprise, and there's security concerns and stuff like that, that's going to indicate that a dedicated VM might be best for you, right? So I can't say what design pattern is best. I won't say that one of the deployment patterns is the best, right? You've got to look at your options. And then obviously, as you need to get high availability, I certainly would never deploy a gateway on an 8 or a 16 core VM. I'd probably look to deploy multiple, like 4 core or multiple 8 core gateways max. Now, so far in our monitoring, we see the gateway not using a lot of CPU, 5% of CPU on the box. So we haven't seen that as a particular problem. Monitoring and troubleshooting. Okay, so let's have a chat about that, right? So the first most common problem is just getting the gateway to work, right? Period. And one of the more common things is firewall needs. Now, it does only make outbound connections, so it's very firewall friendly because it doesn't need an inbound connection, which is what caused most enterprises a lot of difficulty because they don't like to support inbound connections to their internal network, right? Um, so the IP range that it can connect to is as per the Microsoft data center IP list. So there's a good, I put a link at the bottom to what that is. There's a web service that you can call that will get those, and you write some PowerShell script to hopefully automatically update your firewall rules. Okay. So obviously we would recommend kind of whitelisting those IP ranges so they're not blocked. Okay. We do also recommend, if you can, avoiding proxy servers, okay? If you can go out with a routed connection, we found that to give lower latency and better performance because the data isn't being marshaled through the proxy, okay? So that's interesting. What the hell's that do? I have no idea. And if you have configured ExpressRoute, it's not guaranteed that your data gateway will even go down the express route if you haven't activated the public peering, okay? Because it's a public cloud service. If you've only activated the express route to do connect to VMs, you'll need some more advanced configuration of it to activate the public peering to get the cloud-based services to go down the express route as well. Otherwise, you might find your data gateway refresh are wandering over the public internet rather than going down the express route. Now, how do you have some sort of visibility on the performance and errors in the gateway? Okay, well, there are Windows performance counters. Okay, so if I just to show you this, if I just run this, if I run perfmon, performance counter, add counters, I can go to the on-premise data gateway. So let's just go on-premise data gateway. Here we go. And I can add a bunch of counters with theirs. Oh, that's just in the category. Okay, as you see, there's not really much happening at the moment, right? But as it was to get used, I could start to see traffic coming from that. So if you were monitoring, you might want to monitor the number of failed queries per second because this indicates an error. The other things that would look to monitor is the number of items in the service bus pool, because if that is greater than one for a period of time, it means that your queuing architecture is becoming a bottleneck. So this is where you might want to either have, I won't say necessarily a larger gateway server, because there's only a single service bus queue, you might want to have multiple gateway servers and configure the load balancing option so that the queries can get down the gateway faster. Okay, so that's some interesting thing. The other thing that's good to monitor is its CPU kind of usage. And this is if you're considering moving it onto a dedicated box because you think it's stealing CPU from whatever box it's installed on. You can obviously, there's a process counter, and if you monitor that, that'll tell you the percentage of CPU that's used by the data gateway service. So far, we haven't seen it use enough CPU to warrant its own box in most of our solutions on that basis, but it's good to monitor it. Okay, so when things goes wrong, troubleshooting. So there's a range of things. As I said, performance counters. The next both thing is there is a diagnostics mode, and we use SQL Profiler a lot to so we can actually see the queries coming from Power BI to the on-premise data source. Okay, so just to show you what that looks like. go to my computer and go to my gateway, my on-premise data gateway, I can go to the diagnostics. Now I've actually enabled different ones, but if I sign into Power BI, go to diagnostics, I can do a network port test. This is really good if you think you've got like a firewall issue. It'll connect to the various servers and it'll give you a green light on if you've got a firewall issue. Okay, so that's pretty good. And if you have to involve CSS, you can export the logs, which will give you the configuration and stuff like that. Port test result, image, network log. It's actually tell you what your service broker endpoint is, you know, so you can see, well, what IP would I need to connect to? Is my service connect to? Well, that's going to be that one there. So if I ping that, (23.102.53), right? So that's the service broker bus that the on-premise gateway is going to try and poll and connect to. Okay, so you know there's some interesting information in those logs, but to be honest, we most of the problems we tend to find are on the network ports or using Profiler are the two tools that we tend to use. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that was interesting, and